Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Sylvan Leone. I'm the curriculum coordinator of drawing and painting here at the University of Oregon. On behalf of the Department of Art, I feel very lucky to have the opportunity to introduce Rebecca Morris today. Rebecca Morris is an abstract painter whose work delves deeply into materials, form, process, and outcomes, a showcase for her extensive arsenal of techniques and ideas. Her ambitious, large-scale canvases incorporate different manners of mark making and inventively explore questions of frame dynamics and figure ground illusions, often within a remarkably shallow pictorial space. Rebecca Morris was born in Honolulu, Hawaii, and lives in Los Angeles, California. She got a BA from Smith College and MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, after which she attended the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. She's a professor in the Department of Art at UCLA. Her solo exhibitions include Bortolami in New York, the Blaffer Art Museum in Houston, Texas, Mary Boone Gallery in New York, 356 South Mission Road in Los Angeles, the Bonnefantenmuseum in the Netherlands, Kunsthalle Lingen in Germany, Galerie Barbara Weiss in Berlin, Corbett versus Dempsey in Chicago, Harris Lieberman in New York, the Renaissance Society in Chicago, the Santa Monica Museum of Art. Her group exhibitions include Made in LA at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, the 2014 Whitney Biennial, Kunstmuseum St. Gallen in Switzerland, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, the Wexner Center for the Arts in Columbus, Ohio, Victoria Miro Gallery in London, Sammlung Goetz in Munich, David Zwirner in New York, Galerie nächst St. Stephan in Vienna, Austria, the Hessel Art Museum at Bard College in Annandale-on-Hudson, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, Gavin Brown's Enterprise in New York, and the Pitt in Los Angeles. Morris is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and a Tiffany Foundation grant. Other grants include the California Community Foundation, the City of Los Angeles Individual Artists Award, the Durfee Foundation, Art Matters, and the Illinois Arts Council. On a personal note, I would just tell you that the people for whom I am always most grateful are the people who are able to show me things I don't yet know about painting, which I only say out of greed and hunger for new painting experiences. And I feel like every time I see Rebecca Morris painting, I learn something I didn't know about painting. So please help me in welcoming Rebecca Morris.
Thank you so much. That was a really kind introduction. I appreciate that so much. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. It's really an honor to be invited, and so thank you. I'm going to share my screen, and bear with me as I do this. And okay. Take a moment. Okay. And hopefully this is working. Sylvan, if it isn't, please let me know. All right, so I'm showing you a painting that I made in 1995. So it's older work. It was the first year out of graduate school. And it is a plastic stretched over stretcher bars, and then it has Swarovski crystals glued on top in a downward fashion, and there's a detail. So there are all these different sizes of these crystals, and something that I guess I was thinking about this piece again. I mean, I'm calling it a painting, there's no paint on it. There was a period of time when I was exploring how to make a painting without paint. And this is from this time. I think the thing that interests me about this still is that it deals a lot with some of the things I'm still thinking about as an artist. So it's comforting and reassuring to see this from over 20 years ago. And I'm thinking that it's this a kind of illusion of light and space. Literally, you have the shadow of the rhinestones back on the wall through the clear plastic. And then you have their projection into space with their sort of glitter and ding of reflection. And then the actual surface they're applied to, the plastic, is like the literal surface plane. And these are still aspects of space that I'm really interested in: recession, projection, and then the literal surface plane. I'm going to show you some things that interest me from my childhood and just things that I think have been important in forming me as a visual person. This is my grandparents' house from Yonkers, New York. They lived in this house for a really long time. And when I was a young girl, my sister and I would go here all the time to visit our grandparents. It was just like, we grew up in New Haven, Connecticut, and this was, you know, an hour and a half away. And this house was really magical. I think it's like the perfect sculpture. It reminds me of a Mondrian painting because of its Tudor exterior. And I'm pretty obsessed with Tudor architecture, I think, as a result of this house. It also has this rock foundation and detailing, and then these diamond shaped windows in certain places. And then inside the house, there was really interesting interior decorating, like there was a kind of fire engine red tile in the kitchen for a very long time. Then it was replaced with wood paneling. And I have strong memories of this house, and then lots of photographs of this house too. And I used to dream about this house like a couple times a month. It was very intense. And then this is just a kind of interview I did with my friend and painter, Mari Eastman, where I talked about this house and about my routine as a child at this house, where my grandparents would really dote on me and my sister, and I would draw and watch TV. I was really allowed to watch a lot of TV at their house, which was nice. I was not always allowed at my parents' or my mom's. But I loved watching TV and drawing. It was just kind of like background. And my grandparents would bring us malted milkshakes at 3 o'clock. So it was sort of pretty ideal. This is an example of a drawing as a child I did at this time. Again, this kind of obsession with houses and staircases, also these ways to move through space. It's interesting to see these, and then each room has wallpaper and graphics to describe the wallpaper. And I really think I'm just kind of looking at one of my paintings I make today in its own version in the past. And that leads me to show you this picture of my dollhouse. I had 2 dollhouses. This was the second one, the fancier one. And this is a picture of it more recently. It's kind of just wild in there. But again, staircases, windows, grids, compartments, all of these things I think are super interesting to me still. I also take a lot of photographs. It's easier than ever to have a photography practice with a phone these days, but before there were phones, mobile phones, and before mobile phones even had the ability to take pictures, I would carry a 35mm camera around, and I would either load it with slide film or 35mm. And often I would go out one day and take slide film and then return the next day after I finished the slide film and have print film. So this is an example of some of the slide film. And this is all, I think, primarily Chicago when I lived there in the 90s after graduate school. I lived in Chicago 4 years after grad school, moving to LA in 98. I did this project at this time with a journal called White Walls. It was based in Chicago, and I did the front and back cover. So these are from 1997, and this is a painting, 2 paintings that are sort of mirrors of each other. So one painting on the front, the other on the back, and then inside was my photographs that I was taking at the time. Sort of like abstraction in the everyday, vernacular, rock, brickwork, interesting, wall relief sculpture, and again, these Tudor buildings. And Tudor buildings are really interesting because this Tudor design motif goes on all kinds of buildings, whether they're commercial, residential, municipal, or like a wine store, something trying to allude to old world Europe. It's just fascinating to me. And so here are some from Chicago: Mattress King, Irene's Bakery, and I think the one on the top there was from a liquor store. But again, this castle motif is really fascinated by this, and that they all look like drawings. So this is the insert from White Walls. This top image on the left fascinated me because it was a facade that was painted like it was made of massive bricks. And I just thought that was so hysterical. And then also so strange that there's a front door on the very, very right bottom, and then what seemed to be like second or third story windows only. I was fascinated and perplexed by what was happening in that space. This is from New Haven, Connecticut, where I grew up. And this is a parking garage by the architect Paul Rudolph. And my parents would park in this parking garage all the time. There were two department stores that we would go to, Mally's and Macy's. This parking garage is still there. And I have so many memories of this. This architecture made a huge impression on me as a kid. And it's the Temple Street parking garage, and it was built in 1959. So I was growing up in New Haven in the 70s. And the design of it is fascinating because they're not full floors, they're half step parking levels. And so you could, if I'm remembering this correctly, you could drive your car and kind of go between levels and skip the half level. So this idea of kind of skipping levels, or these in-between layers that weren't reachable except by being on a different side of the parking garage. I mean, you can see this kind of interaction of these two halves that meet. So I'm still so fascinated by it. And it's been years and years since I've been in this parking garage, but in thinking about this, I've really got to go back. So the next time I'm in New Haven, I'm going to go back to the parking garage and get in there and drive around. It holds such kind of resonance to me. Also, the way it's built with concrete and wood. The wood is molded to form the concrete. And then when the wood comes off, it leaves this impression, this like stuccoed relief of the wood, which I think is incredibly beautiful. And it's brutalism. And I think, you know, these days brutalism is more admired than ever. I grew up with it. It always felt really kind of comforting to me. I never felt that it was ugly or unattractive. Like these hulking cave-like environments, I thought were sort of womb-like and primordially warm. And so this is some details, and that's the roof. Beautiful light fixture. This is another important building in New Haven. It's the Biennial Library. It was built in 1963. The architect was Gordon Bunshaft, and he actually also did the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, D.C. This is a grid. It's like the perfect grid. It's made of marble and granite. It holds rare books inside, so it's created with very low lighting. And that's the way to kind of protect the books inside. And so there's this inner chamber. Again, even more protection for the books. I think it's climate controlled. So it's just really interesting, this kind of cavity within a cavity. And then the marble is 1 1/4 inch thick. So it's very, very thin given its size. It's, you know, the size of the marble. And I think I'm forgetting the size. It might be like 5 or 6 feet each slab. But what's so beautiful is the way the light, because the marble is so thin, the light can come into the space. So it's filtered and it's incredibly warm. And then this grid structure is just fascinating. And I love how it kind of repeats the books as well. So there's all this repetition and structure with the grid here. Also, an interesting note is that the granite that's holding the marble is designed in such a way that the angles of the corners are pigeon-proof, meaning that it's an uncomfortable angle for birds to rest in, so that birds wouldn't stay and nest in it. And I think that's also sort of fascinating detail. This is the Klaus Oldenburg lipstick sculpture that used to be actually by the Beinecke Library when it was first installed, but it was vandalized. And then it was moved to Yale's Morse College. And, you know, we were in New Haven because my dad taught at Yale. So hanging out at these buildings and being in the area was very sort of my daily life. And my dad would take my sister and I to the lipstick, and we would kind of get ice cream cones and then go hang out at the lipstick. So, you know, that's pretty cool. And this is Klaus Oldenburg with the lipstick. This was its original form. It was inflatable. And so it was very phallic and I think controversial. This is why it was defaced. And it's still there. It's still at Morse College. Okay, so now I'm going to show you my work. This first kind of group of images I'm showing you are installation images from a show I had at the Blaffer Museum at the University of Houston. And this was curated by Tyler Blackwell. And I'm just going to kind of walk through the show. I'm not going to talk too much about these paintings because I'm going to kind of come back to talking about them as I keep going. But what was really fantastic about this space was that this entry space that we're kind of literally in right now had incredibly high ceilings. And I had just made a very large painting that I was not convinced would be able to be shown anytime soon. And this exhibition opportunity came up, and it was just sort of perfect. And that's the painting on the right, that tall one, and I'll talk more about it. But this, I think, gives a sense of my work. So this show was called The Ache of Bright, and I think it was in 2018 in January. I'm trying to remember exactly. And it had work from the last 4 years in it. So my work is, I mean, the compositional structures of my work vary, and there are kind of different typologies within that. And I'm finding these days that the typologies are becoming a little more clear, which is interesting. And then there was a second room. This ceiling was also quite high, but it had a real compression feeling because the first room was so tall. This is a close-up of a smaller painting. So the silver you see is actually spray paint over very thick oil paint. And the rest of the painting is very diluted oil paint. I paint flat on the floor so that I can use very, very liquid oil paint. So the oil paint's diluted in a solvent, terpenoid is what I use. And then to a very watercolor ink-like consistency, I paint and flat. That way I can kind of control some of the, I mean, if it was vertical, the paint would just roll all the way down. So my painting flat, it's kind of almost like a process like drawing in a way. And depending on how much terp I put in, I can control the transparency or how much things bleed. But it's a lot of the way I work is very improvised. So this is this very, very tall painting. It's 152.5 by 82 inches. And it started by just being a primed canvas, just rolled out on my studio floor. And what I did was I just worked on it. On my studio floor, I usually have paper laid out, but when I don't have paper, I'll have canvas. And what the canvas does is it acts like the paper. It kind of protects the floor, but it also catches all the marks from other paintings that are being made. So basically what you're seeing is, you know, all the paintings that I was making during this time period, maybe 6 to 8 months, there's sort of trace elements of all of those paintings, drips, paint tests, things rolling down the side, and this canvas caught them. Originally, I laid out this huge piece thinking I was going to cut it up and make smaller paintings. But as this came together, I was seeing that it was pretty interesting to me as one really long section. And I measured it out and had, this is the painting before I stretched it. So it has a polyester layer underneath, and then I stretch canvas on top of it. The polyester helps the boinging, you know, gives me a little more stability for the canvas. But here it is, this is how big it is in my studio. So it was really, really big. And at this time, you know, none of the galleries that I had relationships with even had architecture, you know, their spaces, this couldn't be shown vertically, and it's a vertical painting. So it was kind of really crazy to make this in a way, but that was, of course, what appealed to me. So here it is in my studio. And here it is in progress on the floor. So you can see there's this pink and white checkerboard painting further down. So that was made on top. And, you know, I would use this to test colors on, clean my brush, get the right amount of paint off my brush, things like that. And then here I had kind of laid it up to demarcate the scale of it. And I should mention that I kind of call this way of working and that way the tarp paintings. So the ones that are made unstretched on the floor, catching drips and marks from other paintings are tarps. So I want to talk a little bit about the grid and my interest in the grid. This is kind of an outlier grid painting, but I think it's good to put in there. It is made, I think what I did here is I painted it black and then I kind of squirt on this white paint in the grid, and then there is a very thick application of oil paint for this circle and the cutaways in the circle, and then it's masked and it was spray painted gold. But what I like about the grid is how it can often be kind of the straight man in the painting, like the thing that creates a natural order or an organization or a kind of an analytical presence when there's some really strange or idiosyncratic mark making or shape making happen. And I think this one is sort of divergent because the grid is very handmade and accidental and not straight and perfect. And it's not even made with a brush. It's just sort of squirt out of a squirt bottle. So it's sort of not the straight man in this painting, whereas the gold form is, and the gold form is very much on top. It's thicker, and it's creating a very intense kind of figure ground where the gold feels very much in front of the black and the white. One of the decisions in using a grid, of course, is how do you organize the grid? And I don't know, you know, I think about this a lot, and what's the best way? What's the grid got to be? So on the left, you see this circle that's being bifurcated down the middle and across. So it's like a crosshairs almost. And then the other side, you have a centered square with the grid radiating off of that. And for me personally, I feel a really different kind of energy in each grid, like the one that's divided down the center or the one that has this kind of openness at the center. And those have really different feelings. And of course, there are variations off of that. And then also another thing to think about, or that I'm thinking about all the time with the grid, is how does the grid meet the edges of the painting? Like, does the grid perfectly fit within the picture plane, or is there this kind of off registration? And then what's the off registration at the top versus the sides? Is that symmetrical, or are those different? So these are all things that I think create a kind of energy and attitude in the paintings that I'm carefully paying attention to in my own subjective point of view. So here's an example of a painting. It's has a very thin silver line around the circle, and then breaking up the internal parts of the circle. And then there's different elements of mark making. And so here, this painting I knew was going to be really crazy, I guess, or was going to have a lot going on in it. It was going to be, I knew the kind of color that was going to be happening was going to be yellows, oranges, blues. It was going to be very vibrant. And so I wanted a grid that felt more analytical. So it being bisected both horizontally and vertically felt important. That felt like it was a kind of code of strictness and severity against this ornamentation and wildness of what was happening in terms of color and mark making. So again, here's like maybe the idea of the straight man. And I'm taking that idea of the straight man from this idea of comedy, where there's this sort of funny person and then there's the unfunny person. And the idea is that the straight man is so straight that the other person could be really funny. It's contrast. And here is the painting for scale. This was at a show I did at 356 Mission Road here in LA in 2015. This is a detail of that painting. So you can see this raised silver line. It's interesting to see this detail now because I'm seeing that one thing I didn't realize is how much thicker these detailed metallic lines have become. Like this is much lower than I would have remembered it being. So here is a tarp painting. This one's done a little differently. I wasn't using it to collect marks. I was just trying to do one sort of color application. And this was really, I made a lot of really stupid decisions when I did this. For instance, for some reason, I ordered unprimed, a huge unprimed amount of canvas, and I should have just had it gessoed. That was really foolish because then it meant I had to gesso this. And then what I did was I gessoed it flat on the floor without it being taut. I don't know, it was like I forgot everything I'm supposed to know about painting. And, you know, I teach beginning painting quite frequently, so this was sort of embarrassing. But the good news was that I got some really interesting results. So what happened was by gessoing it unstretched and flat, it buckled the canvas and then made those buckles kind of firm and solid. And then when I did all of this light purple on top, it really collected into all these folds and buckles that I couldn't get out of the canvas. And so the canvas in this sense behaved much more like paper would in watercolor conditions. So I got a really interesting ground, and that's was amazing. And I was very happy about that. But it was very difficult to stretch. And I got 2 paintings out of this purple tarp. And I wanted to kind of go 2 different directions with the grid. And so the one on the left is a grid of silver lines, and the squares, the grid is much denser. So the squares are much smaller and compacted. And then the grid is like, you know, goes off the picture plane and it's off register. So you can see, you know, these squares and these squares are different. And then there's no containing edge. So it's open. It's like a grid that refers to kind of infinity and it goes off. But because there's so much tight containment with the size, it needed that breadth at the edge. And then the painting on the right has very large squares in terms of the grid, and they're horizontal. And they're very big. And so there's a lot of breadth and space within the grid. And then it has a framic edge around the perimeter of the painting as a kind of containing edge to almost hold the breadth of the painting inside. And so I'm just kind of, I know this is super formal and perhaps incredibly dull, but this is what I'm thinking about. And these are how I'm making decisions. So I'm not even sure a viewer would notice this, but what I'm hoping is that they notice a different kind of experience with the painting based on all of these little things that I'm taking care of. And this is sort of how it looks coming together. So it's the thick paint is applied in the grid in this line, usually a couple layers. It's masked with paper and tape. It's spray painted and then the tape comes off. So something that's been happening in these grid paintings more recently is that the grid is becoming kind of corrupted or broken or ripped or torn. And I'm interested in this because in a lot of my paintings, there are organic edges or boundary lines. And this is something that wasn't happening in the grid painting. So I was kind of thinking about how to combine visual languages and not have these separate pursuits. So having this kind of organic torn edge, which has a lot of illusions. I mean, it can look like an aerial view of a coastline, or a boundary geographically somehow, or just like a torn piece of paper. And so all of these are interesting to me. And I also just like the way it destabilizes the grid. And yet at the same time, it's very clear, and we're always seeing what the grid is over, because it's just sort of like a net over this tarp painting. This, by the way, this is the picture I took on my iPhone in my studio, and this is the professional image. It's really tricky to photograph these paintings. I know every painter says this, every artist says this, but it's hard. It's fine. We are all dealing with this. But so I guess one thing I'm always thinking about when I'm talking about my work is I think there's a value to this image, but there's also a value to this image for me. And I think that to assume that one photograph can capture something is just not possible. I'm a kind of a fan of taking video of paintings these days. I think you can understand the painting better. But in any case, I like showing the sort of amateur shot and the professional shot, because I think they both bring a kind of truth and authenticity to what the work looks like. And so here's another painting. This is another kind of broken grid painting. This is from 2019. Here's the left side is my photography and my iPhone, and the right is the professional image. Now, the professional image is a truer look of this painting. But I like the way in my photography, the gold line feels like lightning, and it's very activated, but the field of gray is too activated and too hyper. It's actually quieter. And so the professional image on the right is more accurate. And I also am interested in, again, this ripped edge, and the fact that the grid isn't very dense in this. So another thing I want to talk about, and I realized I meant to say this at the beginning of this talk, which that I was not going chronologically. I found that giving talks chronologically has been problematic over time, because I find I'm telling a similar story, or I'm putting something in a narrative that's really fixed, and I start kind of believing this chronological story of how everything comes together. And I realized that that's just one version. And so to kind of work against and more holistically share how I'm working, I'm kind of breaking it into these sections. So I hope it's not too disjointed, but I kind of don't want to create this linearity anymore. And I'm not even sure I think that way when I'm making things. So I apologize if this is confusing or off, but I think it's actually more true, a truer way of trying to talk about my work. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is the color pink. This is not my painting. This is a painting by Joan Schneider. This is just a killer pink painting. I saw it at the Felix Art Fair in Los Angeles a couple years ago, maybe 2018, and it just like blew me away. I'm really interested in the color red as a color to investigate, and I sometimes talk about that in talks, but today I'm not going to. I'm going to talk about pink. Pink, and I guess I bring up the context of red because I sometimes talk about my pursuit of the ultimate red painting. And I also have this pursuit of the ultimate pink painting. And what's interesting about the ultimate pink painting is that I think I've been trying to make the ultimate pink painting my whole life. And I've only maybe recently recognized that. So when I saw this Joan Schneider painting, I was just couldn't believe the range that she was getting with pink. And this is my photograph of the side of it. And it's just this gouge, this it's just like this bodily burnt hole all made with paint, and the quality of this pink was so unusual and so ultraviolet and fascinating, and the physicality of this painting was just stunning. And then this is another pink painting. This is made by the painter Mary Lovelace O'Neill, and it's got a strong figurative element in the center, and I just loved the jazzy, wonderful experimentation and embrace of the materiality of the material of paint, as well as the exuberance of the pink and the strong, just the strong forcefulness of this as an image and as scale. Again, just very, very powerful. And then this is a piece by Howardina Pindell. And I wanted to show this because there's a great quote by Howardina Pindell, and I think I've got it on the next slide. She was interviewed for Art Forum, and she says, my use of color goes back to Joseph Albers. I took his color course when I was at Yale in the late 60s. I remember that a woman artist would be criticized if she used pink. If a man used pink, it was considered a mixture of red and white. So the language of critique changed depending on the gender of the artist. When I noticed this, I started using the things that I was told not to: glitter, pink. That was my way of resisting. And I think this is a really incredible quote, and it's something that I can personally relate to. And I also think a lot about painting and abstract painting. I think more and more as a kind of form of resistance. This is a Philip Guston painting. It's, I think, from 1975. It's called Signals. And I'm showing it because Philip Guston used pink all the time. I'd say like 50% of his paintings were pink. And it's just fascinating to me that there is not a lot of information about him and his use of pink. Like, I mean, you can find little bits here and there, but there isn't like a big discussion about this. Periodically, I do a Google search to like see if anybody's finally cracked the nut on this, or published the essay on Guston's use of pink. And there's kind of two things out there. There's a kind of former student of Guston who's a painter, Gary Cormoran, and he has a blog, and this is like from 2017, and he writes about Guston's use of pink compared to his own use of pink. And he says that Guston uses pink in a grimmer fashion as skin is peeled back to reveal the raw pink matter underneath, where blood and pink membranes commingle under the outer skin. And then recently, Amy Silman wrote a catalog essay for the Guston show that was sort of postponed. And she wrote about Guston, and she said that pink often seems to indicate something menacing. So I'm interested in both of these interpretations. And I guess I'm thinking about his use of pink as maybe something about the human condition, trying to articulate something particular about the human condition. This is a bathroom in Germany, and it's at Galerie Barbara Weiss, where I show there. And I was fascinated by this color. It's very difficult to photograph it. I think this is kind of accurate in terms of what the color of this bathroom is, but it was so like this strange in-between color. It almost looks like, what when you see like a model of the inside of a body, like what the color of the liver is always colored. And I had an opportunity to talk to the architect who designed this and chose the pink, and I asked him to tell me about this. And this is all he said. He just said, yes, it's 3 kinds of powder. And it's just stuck with me that this pink is a pink that is made of 3 kinds of powder. So I just keep thinking about this like really old compact blush, or some old brown pink lipstick. And I like rolling this color around in my head. And then I remembered that I had this club when I was in high school. I think I was a junior in high school, and it was called the Mauve Association of America. And we actually had club cards, and we had gone to, I think, a hardware store at the time where they had Formica samples. And we had taken all the mauve mist Formica samples, and then, that's like early Macintosh computer printout, and made these cards for people. And so I found these cards recently, and so this is a picture of it. So it just goes back to this like, I've always been interested in color, and I think I have all these subjective ideas about what color can be, and they're very internalized. They may not really be that interesting to anybody else, but they are a kind of way that I make the work. Like, these ideas are like a combustion to get to painting. This is, so when I said that I think I've always been interested in pink, this is an early painting from when I was in graduate school. I started as a realist painter, and so this is actually a still life painting. It was a big pink rubber fly that I pinned to the wall and did this representational painting of. And it's small, it's like, I think 18 by 24. And then this is another early pink painting I did in graduate school. And yeah, so you see a lot of funny things here, that, this space, this containing area, a form that's bordered by another area, this grid with the pipes, kind of dollhouse shape. I mean, I can remember what I'm looking at. I'm like working with the artist Barbara Rossi. So I think I wasn't even aware of how much I was channeling some of her ideas. And then, Louise Bourgeois' Femme Maison pieces. Yeah. Then this is also early work of mine from graduate school when I'm using glitter and pink. So I think that's one reason that Howardina Pindell remark really stuck with me, with her form of resistance, is embedding, really going and doing all of these things she wasn't supposed to do to be taken seriously. And then this is probably the, again, this period of time when I was trying to make a painting without using paint. And this was probably the most extreme, where it's just two pom-poms with little dog stickers on each pom-pom. And I don't know how it's even stuck to the wall, maybe a little piece of masking tape. And this piece was called I Love Dogs. I mean, I'm very young. And this has the kind of, so this painting is from 2013, and this painting has this kind of pink, fat, wide border. And it was really exciting to get this color, this sort of very particular pink, non-pink color, almost like a dirty ballet slipper. And I think I had originally thought that I would fill in the border and put something else on top of it, but it came out so plain and almost like a fresco, and so magically empty and activated at the same time. Like, the color and the way the color sits on the canvas was what was activating it, but at the same time it almost looked like nothing. I thought that was like, you can't just get that all the time, so I left it alone. And then the inside are these forms and structures where I'm kind of building an energy and a composition. And this is another one after the one I just showed, is maybe 2015. These are two other pink paintings, and these paintings I purposely started them at the same time. They're the same size, and they had the same kind of rules involved in them. I had to use a certain kind of selection of pinks, and think about edges, borders, and internal compartments and how they would meet. So it's interesting to see, if you start a painting with the same idea, where they might go. And then ultimately, what I had wanted to do with both of these was to put a gold border edge on each one of these, but I kind of backed away from that idea because I didn't think it was necessary and it seemed too much. So then I decided to make another version where I would, and that's this. And I think there's a relationship between gold and pink that's really interesting. It's a highly ornamental, highly decorative, maybe even disgusting, gaudy. I think it brings up kind of issues of taste. It can be very severe, but also achingly beautiful at the same time. And I'm really interested in all of that. And I'm also interested in the way that ornamentation can look dated, and that ornamentation, when it's out of style and out of date, is kind of is pretty interesting to me. This is a recent painting with a pink border. So this is, you know, a refrain. And then another recent painting, I'd say in the last 2 years. This is with a checkerboard. And I have been for the last 3 or so, maybe 4 years, doing these checkerboard investigations. And they're just like another way of thinking of the grid. Instead of thinking of the lines of the grid, now I'm thinking about the space between the lines. I'm showing you this small shaped triangle painting because I started to try to make large shaped paintings, and I realized I liked them in small, but not in big. But trying to, let's see how I'd say this. So making a large shaped painting felt too funky. I realized that I really liked the rectilinear format of a square and a rectangle. Again, it had that kind of straight man quality, you know, and I'm talking about this like in the comedic sense, and like this kind of just formation. And what I found was when I started putting irregular shapes within a square or rectangle, I preferred that than, say, making this a shaped canvas that's this big irregular polygon. I sort of didn't want to go into that conversation or that language, but I did like the idea that there would be this irregular shape framed within a rectangle. And what that announced was, what do you do with that space between the irregular form and the edge of the canvas? And in this case, it was just left as gesso. But then I started filling it in, and it started bringing up ideas about, well, which is the part of the painting and which is the frame, or which is the ornamentation and which is the actual focal point? Where's the real thing? Where's the embellishment? And that confusion and that disruption of hierarchy is something that I think all these paintings that have borders or margins are about. And I think at first I was calling them borders, but I think that's not as accurate as saying margin. So that this painting has like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 margins is interesting. And I like the idea of the word margin because of the idea of marginalia and those kinds of things that get put in the margins where you're taking notes and you're putting incidental things there that are important and are often notes that you want to go back to. So it's a way of thinking about the importance of all the parts and sections of the composition and a kind of egalitarian structure. So this is almost the last part of this talk. I'm concerned that this is going on too long. But this is on talk about this kind of series of work I make that are called like what I call the lobster claw paintings. And it's a pet name, it's a nickname. The paintings aren't really have anything to do with lobsters, but there's a hook-like form in them that I kind of, you know, affectionately call a lobster claw. And this is not a lobster claw painting, but it is one that I see as sort of a pre-lobster claw painting. This was like 2003, and this is at the Santa Monica Museum of Art. I had a project room show there, and it was like a concrete block room, and walls were not built, like drywall wasn't put up, so we hung the paintings right against the concrete, which I thought at the time was going to be really challenging, and I actually loved it because the paintings really had to hold up against this really intense brutalist architecture. And I thought they did, which was exciting to witness. So the reason I think this is kind of like a pre-lobster claw painting is it has a kind of flattened, maybe a space that's reminds somebody or people of like cubism in a way, this kind of flat, layered, but then multi-vantage point, viewable kind of depth. Also, there's a play and attention to edges and corners, which all the lobster claw paintings have, and a kind of dynamic energy with points and sharp edges and curves all trying to coexist in a kind of dynamic fashion. So this is from 2006, and I would say this is the first lobster claw painting. All the lobster claw paintings are very big. They're kind of bigger than human scale, and they are all vertical. That's part of their kind of dynamic, earthbound, heaven-reaching kind of energy. There's often these little offshoot triangles that are almost, I see as kind of shrapnel from an expanding or exploding circular form. Here is the painting in an exhibition. And then this is a painting that is also not a lobster claw painting. And I made it, I think, in 2013 or 12, maybe it was 12. And when I made it, it seemed to remind me of this painting in certain ways. And it got me to thinking about that painting. So I thought, gosh, I really maybe should go back to that brown painting and see what is there. And why did this remind me of it? I think it was because of this brown circle coming in here on the right-hand side, some of the palette, and just the vertical energy of it. And I don't know, it just triggered something. And then I also think I would come across this brown painting when I was giving lectures about my work. I would talk about it, and I just was thinking there was unfinished business. So I started doing sketches and drawings of other motifs, other possibilities for that lobster claw painting in the future. And so these were sort of sketches I did. It's a very small notebook, and then I'm sketching other places and taping it in there. So what I did was I took one of these and made a new painting out of it. So this became the second lobster claw painting. And it has this border. So it's got a lot of dynamic energy in terms of movement, but at the same time, I think it feels very frozen and fixed. The border or the margin of this painting kind of holds it in space and keeps it like a snapshot, like it's not moving. But then there's a lot of energy in the mark making and in the swooping nature that I think is a contrast to it. So it's kind of fixed movement. And I hope you can see some of these details are important to see. I think my work can look very graphic in representation and on a screen when it's actually very soft and the edges are not very hard. And this is that painting and another one at the Whitney Biennial. And this, actually, another funny story about this painting was that I knew that, I knew I was going to be in the Whitney, and I wanted to make these two brand new paintings for it, or three rather. And the third one there wasn't room for. And so I was trying to figure out, okay, well, what's the size of the elevator? Because it was in the Marcel Breuer building, which is no longer the Whitney. It's, was the Met, and now it's the Frick. And that building has a lot of spatial limitations, one of which is the elevator. And so I got all the measurements of the elevator and then figured out what was the biggest painting I could get in that elevator. And basically this, whatever it is, I can't remember the size of this painting is the biggest size that can fit in that Breuer elevator. But then the size of my drawing was a different proportion. So that was another reason why I have the border. So the actual size of the painting is the biggest that can go in the Breuer elevator. And then the internal part where the painting is was the proportion of the drawing. So that's a little bit how that was determined. External forces, external architectural forces. And that's the Breuer building. And it was so exciting to have work in this building because, like I said at the start of the talk, these kinds of buildings, this era of architecture is something that I really feel a connection to. And as a little girl and a teenager and a young adult, my whole life, I would go to this museum. And so to actually have work in it was pretty spectacular. So here's the sort of first and second claw paintings next to each other. Then I kept thinking like, okay, I think this is actually, there's a lot here. And this is another drawing, another claw painting. This one also has a border, but there's this scalloped edge. And I was interested in the scallop during this time, 2013, 14, 15, and I think you could see it in other paintings because it just seemed like a very difficult edge to work with. Kind of, again, maybe sort of out of style, problematic, too feminine, too. This was another, also from 2015, I think, large. Now this painting does not have a border. And so I think the energy is different. The flow, the dynamism, I think feels more active and less constrained because it goes off the picture plane, at least at the top or the top two sides. And this again is from the show I had in Los Angeles at 356 in 2015. It's just, I like to show the scale because they are big. And I think when you see an image like this, oh, well, that's actually has the floor. So that's helpful. But when they don't have the floor, it's hard to understand. So when I was working on this painting, at one point in my studio, it was upside down. And I saw it upside down and I was like, oh my God, that's really a great composition. So I made a painting that worked off of the painting upside down, and that became the painting on the far right. So that just to say there's a lot of improvisation, things that happen in the studio. You know, I'm a very studio focused artist. It's a site of experimentation, improvisation, failure, and it's really important to have that kind of working space, and also that I'm there by myself. I like to be by myself working. I can't work with anybody else around. And I need to think. So this is actually just shows you like the paint's very liquid. It has to be in a bowl. I use really cheap brushes. I'm partial to these chip brushes. You can just buy the box. It's another lobster claw painting. So I'm sort of investigating different verticalities, different color schemes. This one has I think has a kind of a floral dynamism to it. These kind of pale spring greens and purples, pinks, and a lot of circular energy. And maybe even a kind of Art Deco structure. And these are two of those claw paintings that made in LA. An exhibition at the Hammer Museum, like a California Biennial exhibition. And this is so how do you make a painting in red with these shapes and not have it look like fire? I hope, does it look like fire? All those California wildfires were happening when I made this. I always think there was some like unconscious thing, but this wasn't one of my sort of ultimate red paintings. And I think it isn't ultimately an ultimate red painting because it doesn't have the full thrust of red that I think an ultimate red painting should have, but I still think it's a really powerful painting. And just because it didn't make ultimate red painting status doesn't make it a less than painting. It's just this idea of ultimate red painting is a way to like lead me through making work. But I wanted this intensity of red, this urgency of red. This is a detail. This is one in progress. Here it is finished at Bortolami Gallery. I'm just going to go through this quickly. We're almost at the end. This is my show I had, solo show last year at Bortolami Gallery. It opened, I think, about 3 weeks before the pandemic, and then was, you know, shut down like so many shows, and reopened a little in the summer. But I'm thankful that it was up for 2.5 weeks or so before this horrible year. This is just a close-up of a tarp painting, and it has gold lines on it. So again, you can see how the composition is isolating these forms and shapes and fitting them together, kind of like a map, or not a map. And then this is a checkerboard painting from last year. It has a very, very thin gold edge to it, like its own personal frame. And then this is a very recent painting, all in this really intense azure blue, kind of purpley blue color. Very, you can see all the marks, very gestural. One thing that's nice about making a painting like this, where the blue field holds the shapes, is that the shapes can be really irregular and not have to fit into each other like puzzle pieces. So they can be very unique and autonomous. Whereas some of the other paintings where these forms all have to abut and piece together creates a really different structure. And then there's a thin sort of iridescent aqua trim that's not raised, but just, you know, iridescent oil paint running down the side. So that, I'm trying to unshare my screen. That is my talk. So,
thank you so much, Rebecca. That was really so wonderful. And we have some terrific questions from the audience, so I'm just going to jump right into them. The first is from my colleague Jovencio de la Paz, who asks, I'm interested in your assertion that abstract painting is a form of resistance. Could you expand on that idea, as well as the nascent idea that color and the formal is embedded with politic?
That's a good question. So it's funny, like thinking about this idea of abstraction and resistance has been so present in my work for a long time, and yet I feel kind of new to it in a weird way. Like sometimes the thing you're doing, you're sort of the most unaware of. But when I think about like how I title works, like I don't title them, I give them a numbering system. And, you know, when people ask me what my work is about, I'm, you know, I mean, there are things and ideas I get, but I tend not to share them because I don't want to have to give that information away. Like it's a way of taking the creative energy, like that kind of secret nucleus that you make work from. Like if I hand that over, I'm worried that I can't get it back or I've extinguished it. And then also I don't always feel that it's so important to name things all the time. And I think like we can sometimes believe that language, you know, that there's visual language that's different than written and expressed language, you know, verbal language, and the idea that I'm not going to talk about what the things are and that you have to experience it and maybe experience it in person is that kind of resistance to naming things and categorizing things, which I think can be limiting and get us into trouble. And I think coming from being a realist painter, one of the things I was really frustrated by in making realist painting and the way I was making realist painting as a young person was that when people would talk about my work, they were always correcting it. Like, oh, you got to move the shadow over, or the light source, or the color's not right. And I was just like, ugh, like, I want to be my own master of my universe, you know, to use my own words. And so like by completely making up all the rules, I did that. And I couldn't have someone like telling me what things could be. Now, of course, I could have made realist paintings that way too, but you know, I think there were other things happening. So this resistance idea is something I'm interested in, and just and the stubborn quality of holding back or redirecting. And then color as political. Yeah, I mean, that's something I think about a lot. I mean, it comes up with the color pink in a very pointed way. With other colors, it may not come up as much, but with pink it does. And like, you know, my mentioning of Howardina Pindell and also my work when I was younger artist was a lot of pink and purpley kind of, you know, these colors we associate with a kind of classic heterosexual femaleness. And I just remember that was always seen as the content of my work when I used those colors. And it when I was a younger woman, that bothered me. I also think it was me. I was doing things in the paintings that was getting that response, but I was frustrated by pink because people just wanted to talk about that I was a woman using pink, and it was about gender and about being a woman. And I wanted to just make paintings as a person. So I stopped using pink for a long time and have come back to it because I don't care anymore. And I also think that if I keep using it, and I think the discussion has gotten much more advanced too. We have much more sophisticated ideas about identity. But also I think pushing through it was something that gave the power back to me, and that I don't have to be reduced to just, you know, being a woman and making pink. But I know that maybe it wasn't totally answer that question, but maybe close enough.
That's great. Donald Morgan, another of my colleagues, asked, outside of art and architecture, are there any other creative fields like music, film, or literature that you were inspired by or influenced by?
Is that Donald Morgan who asked that question?
Yeah.
Hi, Donald. Yes, I'm really interested in film. And sometimes in lectures, I show film stills. One film in particular that's been really resonant with me is the Ingmar Bergman film Cries and Whispers, which is pretty much an ode to red and dying, which I think is like every frame is a painting. And I think a lot of filmmaking is like this. And so I also think I'm fascinated by Antonioni's Red Desert, which was Antonioni's first film in color, which is fascinating because when you see it, you realize how kind of little color is in the film. You know, it's a very melancholic, lots of grays, browns, and greens, and then every once in a while these like intense pops of yellow and red, and it's just really intense to think that's going to be your first color film that's so low key. So I get really interested in things like that. And then, you know, films from the 70s, anything really character driven, I love. Literature, yes. It's hard when top of my head. My dad's a composer, so I grew up listening to a lot of non-Western music and have always, you know, just loved music in general. And so, yes to music.
Great. That kind of leads perfectly into the next question, or at least the part about color. Someone asked, do colors influence your sense of scale in your work?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
I think it's like how much of a color, you know, like how big a field or how big a section is. Yeah. I think that's interesting to think about color that way.
Yeah. I mean, you talked about the ultimate red painting. I can't help but go to Vir Heroicus Sublimus and like.
Of course. Yep. That's an ultimate red painting for sure.
Yeah.
There are so many out there, and really good red painting.
Someone else asked, I found your use of tart painting very interesting. I'm curious if this is a reflection of studio waste and excess.
Yeah. I mean, the reason I started rolling down canvas on the floor was that I was putting paper down first. I was putting paper down because I'm working on the floor. And so if the floor is too dark or irregular, it's distracting. And so I kind of needed a white ground to put the paintings on so that I could just kind of be in the paintings. And so I was putting this white paper down, but then inevitably I was just seeing all of this great stuff that was happening on the paper. And I was losing it because it's paper that's going to get thrown away. So I started rolling out canvas to see what would be there if I caught it. And so, yes, it's about excess and eliminating waste.
Great. Well, I think those are all the questions we have. So, so thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Appreciate it. Yep. Bye-bye.